How are you?
I'm fine. Congratulations.
Oh, yeah, and you too. Are you going to have one of these?
I hope so.
And I see Sister Janice. Hello. Listen, this is very interesting for me because Sister Janice is a nun. And so she may say, Tess, you got it all wrong. Don't say that, okay? Don't say that, Sister Janice. Sister Janice and I met on a film project that's going to be released in the future very soon. And she is one of the people we interviewed and got to know, and I fell in love with. So Sister Janice, she is of the moment, in the presence. And so she works with people in this moment. So she makes no judgments, and she's there to simply help people. And I have fell in love with her. And she always puts a sign of the cross on my back when I leave. So I know she's praying for me. And I see Terry and Phil Cleaver. Are you over there?
Yes,
Phil?
I'm here.
Hi, Phil. How are you?
Good.
Good. Oh my God. It sounds so nice to hear your voice. That's wonderful. That's really great. That's really great. And Barry, are you there, Barry?
I am here.
Hello, Barry. You know, I left Lawrence and moved to Virginia.
Wow.
So, I know it's, yeah, we had to come here because we have 3 grandkids here, and then we'll spend the summers in Minnesota with the other 2, but it was time. It's time to acknowledge where you are in the world. Terry, are you there?
Hi, Tess. Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Terry. I haven't seen you for a while, so it's good to see you. I just want to say I'm very excited about this group because I think this is a very dynamic group. And because I know some of the people that have logged in, I don't know all of you, but I think that's really, really good. And feedback is wonderful. And I have a real nun with me, so she can have some sort of perspective, I think. And I really appreciate you taking the time to do this and talk about this story. I can tell you early on in my writing of this story, I was driving down the highway and I heard an NPR story about a part of Atlanta, Georgia, where 40% of the kids had experienced post-traumatic stress disorder. And even at that time, I was well into telling this story. I didn't understand what that really meant for this character. And it was from that, I said, I need to explore what that means. And so I believe that at some point, that is what our protagonist experiences, but not in total. So it's part of the story. So I want to start with, I want to introduce the monster that lives in Elizabeth's house. Elizabeth took her turn helping out in the kitchen. Her jobs were minimal and nothing close to cooking or what might be expected of a Catherine. Elizabeth peeled potatoes, set the table, but never had to read a recipe. She watched and marveled at her mother's skills. The hands that flew across the black and white keys of the piano worked as well whipping up potatoes or batter for pancakes. There wasn't a recipe she avoided. Elizabeth wondered where her mother learned so much. The other things like laundry or house cleaning happened because everyone had a chore. But Elizabeth hardly noticed those. It was food that was important because a missed meal meant something different in this family. Everyone knew that a diabetic had to avoid sugar and eat on time. Being on time for the family meal was a rule that couldn't be broken. The family routine gathered before the father went off to work the night shift at the railroad. Meals were always a high alert time, especially for Elizabeth. Would her father like what Suzanne cooked? Would he be in a foul mood? Would they have sugar beets, which Elizabeth hated? And would Elizabeth be required to sit until everything on her plate was eaten? This was the time that Elizabeth had most of her bad thoughts about her father. Junior sat at a long wooden table with benches, reading the paper with a cigarette dangling from his mouth, his fingers yellow from tobacco. The table was much more like a picnic table than a real table, not like the table of Elizabeth O'Sullivan's grandparents. The kitchen was well used, circa 1940s, appliances and cracked stained countertops. A damaged sink filled with cooking utensils set under a window that faced out into a backyard. in view of a small space with a dilapidated shed off to the side with junk. It was a treasure chest, generally off limits to the children. The back door opened onto a small screen porch. Each child had their place at the table. As luck would have it, Elizabeth sat next to her father and Patrick across from her. She didn't really understand how she got that spot and wished she sat in another room as far away as possible. Suzanne sat directly opposite from Junior, next to John in his high chair. At 3, John was not much of a baby. His role as a baby was to provide cover for Suzanne, at least at mealtime. Junior, intent on the paper, didn't notice as the children filed in and found their spots. James next to his mother, closest to Elizabeth, Patrick next to Catherine. Junior looked up as if on cue, put the paper down. Without commotion or fanfare, he brought his hands together and bowed his head. Suzanne and the children, even John, followed his lead. Junior prayed, "Bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts, which we are about to receive from thy bounty through Christ our Lord." The children looked up, but Junior kept his pose. "We are especially thankful to have family back together. We are thankful that Suzanne has recovered from her fall. Amen." He then raised his hand with a genuine smile on his face as a quiet encompassed the room. Junior looked to Suzanne for recognition and she smiled tentatively, just enough. Junior's smile widened as the children exhaled. "Hey, pass the chicken," he commanded. The ritual began and the platter and bowls were passed. It was a good Sunday meal with chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans, and rolls. The father was happy. And then the sugar beets arrived, causing Elizabeth to balk. She knew this would be hard. Maybe he wouldn't notice, she hoped. Maybe he had something to do and would leave the table before she finished. She knew she would gag if forced to eat the sugar beets that Junior seemed to love. Sugar beets. There was nothing sugar about the beets. Whoever named them probably couldn't tell the difference from eating dirt, she thought. As the bowl of sugar beets were passed to Elizabeth, she hesitated before taking one and putting it on her plate. She quickly looked over at Junior, who was distracted by the platter of chicken that came his way. She was saved for the moment, if only she could outlast him. Junior, with his mouth full, chewed, then looked over at Suzanne. The children watched his every move. "I bought Mom a special gift, a music box, because she loves music so much. It's pretty, I do say of myself," he proudly announced. Quiet. Do they acknowledge the break in silence or do they ignore? They knew it would probably be Patrick who would make a remark. He had the least to lose and was the best at making conversation. Patrick didn't look much like an O'Sullivan as the children, but more like the Peterson side of the family, more like Suzanne's father. "Yeah, we saw it, Dad. It looks real nice," Patrick replied. Junior smiled and took a big bite of chicken. Patrick was also a good storyteller, and Elizabeth liked that about him. He brought to life images, almost like a camera taking photos, and then he spit out the tales to thrill his audience. There wasn't much he couldn't do: math, science, even history. Most importantly, he knew how to handle his father. "Now that you kids are home, it's back to business. I want this house clean when I come home, no stuff laying around. I know what bad habits you might have picked up at Grandma's," he smiled. That was really stupid comment, Elizabeth thought. Grandma Vina ruled her house with an iron fist. But equally important was the fact that at the home that Elizabeth lived in didn't have much stuff to lay around. The house was as sparse as a job during the Depression. She had heard Grandma Sullivan make that comment. Was her father trying to be funny? Yes, he was, she concluded. That was a good sign. Her encounter with the sugar beets was looking like a thing of the past. This day might turn out just fine. Junior pushed his plate away just a bit longer. Elizabeth thought. She was hopeful. Maybe he'll go lie down for a nap. "Suzanne, how much insulin do I have in the fridge?" No such luck, Elizabeth realized. Suzanne got up from the table, stepped over to the fridge. She pulled out a vial of insulin and held it up for him to see. "It's full. Good. I might need some later," Junior remarked. What does that mean? Elizabeth wondered. Patrick was always on his toes, assessing. "You working the second shift?" Junior looked over at Patrick. "No, I'm heading down to the flood room for some cards." Patrick nodded. Elizabeth knew there was something else about Patrick, especially when it came to their father. It was as if he were a step or two ahead. Elizabeth admired that about her brother. She saw his skill just as James and Catherine saw it, but neither she nor the others had Patrick's capacity. They were always on guard, but not prepared. Patrick was on guard and always had a plan. He didn't always act. Sometimes he just watched. Junior leaned back in his chair and looked over at Elizabeth. Elizabeth moved the beet around her plate with her fork. She was stalling, hoping he would get up and move away. You don't like beets, do you? He said, looking sharply at Elizabeth. Her hand slipped with the words, do you? And she accidentally pushed the beet juice off her plate onto the white tablecloth. A dark stain immediately appeared. Somewhat frightened, Elizabeth quickly looked up, hopeful that somehow he overlooked the misdemeanor, but he had not. She knew what was coming. There was nothing she could do. The monster was about to arrive. She saw the familiar steam sneaking out of his nose, his eyebrows growing thick formations like an awning over his eyes. His teeth protruded, causing his lip to disappear. The monster finally brought up his hand that now appeared to be a paw with claws that could rip her face off. She hunkered down while he slapped her hard. She had had worse, but it still hurt. It was premature assault, but at least he wasn't fully a monster yet. James attempted to stand, but Suzanne was right behind him to reach out and gently restrain him with her hand placed on his shoulder. Look what you've done, Junior said, his voice distorted. All I wanted was a nice meal. Is that too much to ask? Elizabeth watched closely as the monster struggled to get up from the table. He'd grown so tall that his head brushed the ceiling, while his toenails, sharp as butcher's knife, cut through his shoes, leaving them in shreds. He arose and took one big step to grab Elizabeth's plate from the table and deliver it to a cracked sink, slamming it down with force. It was as if he were auditioning for a movie, but the audience had seen it all before. Quietly, he stood at the kitchen window while no one moved. What would he do? Everyone wondered. Was this the last of it or just the beginning? This time, he hadn't been drinking. He was stone cold sober. He had plans and needed to calm down so he could return to the human form before he left the house. Elizabeth wasn't going to wait to find out what he would do next. Patrick caught Elizabeth's attention and discreetly moved her eyes toward the kitchen door. Elizabeth knew what that meant. She eased off the bench, trying not to make the slightest bit of noise. She rounded the corner of the kitchen and looked back to see the soldiers of the monster's frame burst through his shirt. Her tiptoe exit sped up. She flew across the living room, up the stairs into the bedroom. The door closed gently beside her as her face flooded with tears. The bedroom window was open. Good, she thought. If he comes looking, he will think I made my way out the window, onto the roof, then onto the tree and away. Elizabeth was lucky. She had a place no one else had. It was hers alone. Through the tears, she found her way past the neatly made beds to a small closet. Behind the dress-up clothes, worn only on special occasions and Sunday Mass, she pushed a small panel that opened to reveal her sanctuary. It was a place so small it would hold only Elizabeth and maybe a toddler like John, although she would never invite him into her special place. She crawled in, pulled her legs up against her chest, and rocked. The routine of an abused child was automatic. First she cried, then pulled at her skin, and then at her eyelashes. The pain must equal the anger or she would burst.
Tess, this is Terry. Well, you know how hard it's been for me to sit down and read during the
Yes.
pandemic. So I'm so excited about the audio. That was just, and I did read part of it and can relate to so much of it, but that was just captivating. So I can't wait to listen to it. That I was like, don't stop. Right.
Well, I have to say that the important part is what I learned about post-traumatic stress disorder in children, and they do things like that. I was not aware of that when I started the book, and I consulted with a therapist who worked with children who suffered from that, and found out that that's one of the things they do. They do self-harm, and one of the things that I did as a child, well, I want to put right out there that, as my brother said, it's truth, partial truth, and flat out lies. So this is not an autobiography, but a lot of it is, it really is part of my life. And one of the things that I did as a child under these very stressful times is I was pull out my eyelashes. And I didn't even know at the time when I was writing this book that that was one of the symptoms that children who experience a post-traumatic stress disorder. So I think of the children that are left at the border that are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. And they are, I mean, I would like to challenge them to find out what these children are doing to themselves. Because for Elizabeth, she had to balance the extreme pain that she felt with the outside, or she would just simply explode. And that's why she yanked out her eyelashes. She had to make some equilibrium. So it was really important to me in telling the story that right up front, I let you know what's at stake. The stakes are quite high. Yeah, sister.
When you talked about your small private place, it reminded me of a brother-in-law of mine whose dad was an alcoholic, and he would go hide in the kitchen cabinet and take a book with him.
Oh, wow.
And that would get him away from what was going on the outside.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That fits in perfectly.
Mhm.
Every little kid that can find a space to go and hide and somewhat take themselves out of that world is really important for them, I think. Yeah, thank you, sister.
I had a question, Tess.
Yes.
Did you, from the beginning, when you started writing the book, did you always know you wanted to characterize the father as a monster?
You know, at the very beginning, I don't know. I didn't know how to do it, but I did want to make sure that people understand the way children think in those environments. And if any of us go back to our childhood, so much of it's made up. I mean, we go into a pretend world, all of us do. And I had very mixed feelings about my father. And I think any child that has been in an environment like that, they do have mixed feelings. But at some point, I did understand that he was a monster. And what he did was really wrong. And I think that was a saving grace for me. And so when I was writing this story, I wanted to get into a child's head. And fantasy is a big part of what kids do. If even in your own lives, I would ask you to think back to how you visualize the world. And it's very, very like cartoonish almost. And it's this made up world. And that's the way she could deal with him, was to identify him as less than real, that he was a monster. He was made up. And I don't think she allowed herself to see him as what he was very, very human, very human. So he had to be more than that. So that's how I came up with, I've got to show him as she would see him.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yes, Chris.
Hi, Tess. Great. That's wonderful. Well, it's horrifying stuff, but it is wonderful in the following context. It's not something I can relate to, but either when I read about it or hear you read it, or see it on film, it's so alien from my own growing up, fortunately. I had loving parents, and nothing like that ever occurred. So for me, it's really what I see the really big challenge is how your writing and description of it can describe what is, to some of us, a completely alien world, and it's a grotesque world. But it's such a, I can imagine writing it as such a tightrope affair. On the one hand, you had to make this alien world, you had to immerse the reader and a reader into that alien world, a reader that never experienced anything like that in his or her childhood. And on the other hand, part of that tightrope, not falling off, is not to make it overly dramatic to the point where it's well, it's too forced. So it's that, and this is what I really appreciate in your creative work, is how you manage to walk that tightrope and make a horrifying world, bring a reader into a horrifying world and keep the reader there, and almost understated.
Well,
And to try and understand what the child is going through from the child's perspective. Yeah.
that was really important to me, to try to remember and to appreciate that we think we know what's going on with kids, but kids take in those worlds so differently than what we think.
Yeah.
And I'm so happy to hear that you had a really nice life, because I think a lot of people do. And this comes as sort of a surprise about, could there possibly be a world like this where
Right.
children imagine people as monsters because it makes it more easy to understand? But there are children like that. So it was really, it for me, it's always a tightrope to walk. Sometimes I get it right, sometimes I don't. To have them fall off, as you were saying, to fall off. And I tried really hard not to do that. And sometimes I think I accomplished it, and sometimes I don't think I did. But that was certainly was a goal for mine, Chris. Absolutely.
Yeah, and there's also the power of survival, that
Mhm.
no matter what's happening to this, the horrifying things to this child, the child is adapting psychologically in her way.
You know, the truth is, I have known people who had much worse lives than this. And I have always, growing up in Kansas City, Kansas, there would be a chance that you might know a few more of those. And some of them just absolutely excelled. And, I kind of took that on and I thought, how does that happen in my own life? And all of my siblings were successful people. Some of them have passed on. But you look at it and say, what is the difference? What is the difference in these children's lives, that some of them are able to get through it and some don't? And I would venture to say there is some adult in these children's lives at some point that makes a difference. And that's some sort of competent of adult in children's lives. And that's why in this story, there are people that emerge, that do things, because I don't think that any kid can make it without some adult stepping in at some point, because
Right.
they either end up in prison or all kinds of bad things can happen. But if there isn't a competent adult, I think things change. That's my personal belief.
Good, thanks.
I found it kind of interesting, the descriptions of the various children and their sort of role in the family. And their not a lot of detail of their relationship to each other, but definitely some about their roles and about her admiration for her brother. And I wonder, because I've seen this in dysfunctional families, one person is often the bad kid, quote unquote. And no matter what they do, it's not going to be right. And no matter who does something to set off the monster, that kid is going to get blamed.
Mhm.
And I feel like that was clearly Elizabeth's role in this family. Not that, she did anything to deserve it, but it's just the way it is. And I think this was descriptive of that phenomenon that I have seen it play in various families that I knew, like growing up, and in certain friends that I have that are adult survivors of that.
Mhm. It's sort of the identified patient in a family is the person that's easy to kind of unload on. I think that happens all the time. There's one kid that kind of gets it all regardless. And that's unfortunate because sometimes it's because they walk too heavy or they're not very coordinated or they don't do things quite right. It's really easy to unload on them. In Elizabeth's case, part of it had to do with her impulsivity and her doing things. And the other children were wicked smart about that, much more than she was, to be honest with you, this character. So you're right. They do grow up, and it's kind of sad because kids just do stupid stuff. And we all do stupid stuff. But for kids to get identified so early as sort of the bad patient is really sad. And you're absolutely right. I think, Barry, that happens all the time, all the time.
I've been a disability lawyer for a long time, and my experience has been seeing this as through people, middle-aged women mostly, that have had these experiences in childhood, and they've managed to suppress many of the problem areas somehow, and then somewhere in midlife they can't do that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I never really thought about it. So your work is very interesting because I hadn't thought about what it would be like from the child's perspective, how you get to that point.
Mm-hmm.
That I see, and the consequences of it, and the repetitiveness of it in certain families. And I think that the wisdom that you bring to us of the child and how that looks at their level maybe can open some doors so that can be addressed sooner instead of waiting till it metastasizes about 45 or 50.
Mm-hmm.
A whole bunch of things going wrong in an adult life.
That was clearly, Patrick, that was clearly my intention. I really wanted people to understand that this is a child's view of the world.
Yeah.
And it's really important that we take that in and we try to understand it. I don't know that all of us were children at some point, and we know that we had a way of looking at the world. And I think it's really important that we don't expect children to be adults. That's just, they're not, but they really inform us and what we do, as you said, Patrick, later on in life. Wow, what a day, Elizabeth thought. She would never forget it. She looked down the long hallway at the children from her class, both fifth and sixth graders, who took up most of the space on one wall. Elizabeth stood at the end of the line, right behind Catherine. There was silence that occupied the moment. When Catherine was especially put out with Elizabeth, the moment could last for at least an hour. There was no use in trying to talk to her. Why did you take it? Catherine whispered into Elizabeth's ear. What? She talked to me. Surprised. Elizabeth looked away and stepped back. I know nothing, Elizabeth replied, never looking Catherine in the eyes. Catherine was on edge as she moved closer. Elizabeth, it's a sin to steal. It's a sin to lie. Will you do that for me? Elizabeth crossed her arms and glared at Catherine. There, take that, Elizabeth thought, a real act of defiance. She was putting Catherine in an awkward position. Would she go down the path of righteousness, or would she stand with her or just leave? Tell the truth, Elizabeth. There was anger in Catherine's voice that Elizabeth had not heard before, but she was not afraid. She had grown a foot today, and she was not going back. Plus, she had a backup plan. You tell the truth, her sister again commanded. The door to the office opened. Richard followed Sister Mary Rose into the hallway. He walked past Elizabeth and stared. The stare was lost on Elizabeth. She didn't realize he wanted to help her. He knew she took the holy card, not only because he saw her, but because there was not another student who would be so bold or so strong. So he lied. For the first time in his life, his speech impediment was a gift. They would not want to wait through his contemplative silence, waiting for the right breath to come into his throat and mouth to make the words work. He waited, they waited, and then he shook his head. He had lied with just one knot because he admired Elizabeth. He too felt a foot taller, a day he would never forget. So it went with different children entering and exiting the cold, bare office at 3-minute intervals. Elizabeth couldn't care less. She didn't try to read their faces. She figured they were all saying she had done it, but none had. When summoned, Catherine stepped forward, turned and scowled at Elizabeth. They locked eyes. Then in slow motion, or what seemed like forever, Sister Mary Rose ushered Catherine into the office. Elizabeth, alone, began a game of pretend hopscotch. She mentally jumped from floor tile to floor tile until she reached the end of the hallway. She turned and went back again twice. She was flying. She was fully exhausted, but willing to go the length of the hallway again to break the record she had posted in the Olympic game of hopscotch when she heard her name, Elizabeth. There was no hint of kindness in Sister Mary Rose's voice as Catherine emerged from the Inquisition. Catherine passed by and gave Elizabeth the evil eye, a good sign for sure. If Catherine had told the interrogators the truth, there would be hurt on Catherine's face, not anger, Elizabeth decided. She was done with hurt and silly feelings. She knew she needed to toughen up. She had already started today with her performance. She might have been hurt when she looked into the eyes of her classmates, but no, she didn't care. She was someone else, a better version of herself. Yes, she knew about the hurt. She had seen it, felt it. She knew she had to throw up a nerve about to hurt when it started to come. Hurt came when she least expected it, based on some unknown feeling, popped up like a jack-in-the-box. Hurt and fear were tied together. Anger intrigued her. Just a mere spoonful was enough. Nothing like the gallon of anger that morphed when heated into the rage that propelled the twin monsters. She would have to find anger and use it when necessary, like Catherine with the evil eye as she passed by. Just once, she would love to give someone the evil eye as an exclamation at the end of a sentence. She had never given it to anyone, not even her baby brother, whom she knew needed the occasional evil eye. He would probably just laugh, mimic her, and look cute. The penguin sat on one side of the table, Sister Mary Rose next to her. Elizabeth looked around the room. She had never been in the office. It was a private place just for nuns. A large cross, minus Jesus, hung on the wall behind the interrogators, forming a trinity. Off to the side of the metaphorical triumph, above a file cabinet, was a picture of St. Teresa with little flowers. Elizabeth always liked the way St. Teresa looked with flowers all around her. The other St. Teresa, with a different spelling, was also a Carmelite, but less glamorous. The Carmelites were heavy duty, no fluff for them. They were cloistered. Elizabeth didn't really understand the word, but it reminded her of a closet, and she knew something about closets. She hoped there might be a wink coming her way from the saint and all the flowers, but the little saint was silent. Another time, maybe. Sister Mary Rose cleared her voice, hoping to get Elizabeth's attention. The child seemed indifferent. Did she not get the gravity of the situation? Elizabeth, Sister Mary Paul seems to think that you know something about the missing holy card. Do you know anything about the holy card? Elizabeth looked first at Sister Mary Rose, then at the cross, the penguin, and finally the picture of St. Teresa. It pained her a little to lie to a woman she loved so much, the nun with the perfect smile and the kind eyes, but she had no choice. She would defeat the penguin, which was becoming less of a challenge with each passing moments. Do I know anything about the missing holy card? No, sister, I do not. That was a nice big lie. Elizabeth knew she had slid down a slippery slope. She could sense it, a new feeling. It was easy to lie when you weren't afraid, and she was just warmed up. Throw another one her way, she was ready. The penguin fumed, but the steam that lessened and turned into sweat on her upper lip. She was changing right before Elizabeth's eyes, monster to penguin to nun. It was working. The less she feared, the more real the nun seemed. She could match her evil with her own. The squatty nun glanced at Sister Mary Rose and then leaned across the table, lifting herself out of the chair as the chair slipped back. Your sister says she knows nothing about the holy card, but I think she does. I think everybody knows. She looked over her shoulder at Sister Mary Rose and then back at Elizabeth. You're not fooling me, you little devil. Perfect. Elizabeth was ready. This was too easy. Catherine was nearly a saint, and everyone knew that Elizabeth twitched to make it look different to answer. Here it comes, salvation, she mused. Well, Catherine never lies. If she says she knows nothing, I would take her at her word. There it was, the truth turned upside down. Elizabeth smiled. Mary called to Sister Mary Rose, but Sister Mary Rose didn't acknowledge her. The sweet sister was intent, watched Elizabeth with concern. She was worried for this little girl's soul. It was apparent she was lying and enjoying it. A rush of anger rose to Sister Mary Paul. Elizabeth could see it, but not feel it. Then it dawned on her that Sister Mary Paul's anger was at Sister Mary Rose. She was simply a bystander. Even at this moment, Sister Mary Paul thought, when the sister should be my partner, she is more interested in what this little liar is saying. Well, this will get Sister Mary Rose's attention. Sister Mary Paul turned, bent down so she was eye to eye with Elizabeth. She reached out to slap her face, but Sister Mary Rose blocked her hand and pulled her hard, jerking her back. Instinctively, the irate nun resisted. She liked the tussle and connection. She liked the other nun's hand on her arm. Sister Mary Rose then pulled harder, almost shoving the nun away from Elizabeth, which sent the older nun sailing backwards. Sister Mary Paul hit the wall with a crashing smack, her head bouncing off the wall and hard into the floor. The momentum flung her body underneath the table, leaving her feet in laced up shoes with a slight heel sticking out from below. Elizabeth noticed and immediately thought of The Wizard of Oz, her favorite scary movie. Sister Mary Paul's habit was up around her knees, revealing heavy stockings on equal legs. One leg was definitely shorter than the other. Elizabeth peeked over the table, and there it was, the nun's leg, very much like her mother's. Elizabeth gasped and covered her mouth. The monster was really a human after all. But what about the monster who lived in her house? That monster came out when the sugar was too high or not high enough, or if he was just in a nasty mood. Her mind whirled, the scene a blur. Was the disappearing monster, now slightly penguin, mostly nun, really hurt or just pretending, preparing to leap up and grab her? She steadied herself, quick into the survival mode. She grabbed her body with her arms. Sister Mary Rose looked at Elizabeth and recognized the maneuver of self-protection. Sister Mary Paul's anger had simmered, but had lost its heat like the dying embers of a fire. She was now pathetic with her small leg and pale face joining the remaining lifeless lump. The change was complete. The monster was dead. Sister Mary Rose dropped to the floor, felt for a pulse, and listened to Sister Mary Paul's breathing. She was breathing, thank the Lord. Sister Mary Rose looked up at Elizabeth. She's unconscious, get help. She had a very worried tone in her voice. Elizabeth pondered, and then a smile crossed her face. Elizabeth caught the look, cringing inside, but Elizabeth knew exactly where she would go and what she was up and out the door. Catherine stood against the wall, waited. She could not leave until she was sure Elizabeth was not repelled. The behavior was risky because she could be sent home for disobedience, but she didn't care. She reached for Elizabeth the moment she saw her, but Elizabeth never looked back. She was on a mission. Her ears closed to the voice that cried out her name, and she was excited. It seemed like something out of a Joan of Arc legend. She was on her white horse, galloping across the field into battle with her armor clanking and her sword held high. She leapt down the stairs and led out to the playground and to the castle, down to Main Street. Stunned and torn, Catherine peeked into the office. What would she see? What had Elizabeth done? She heard the muffled words in the scuffle. Elizabeth must have done it this time. Sister Mary Paul's feet stuck out from under the table. Elizabeth's mouth dropped open. Sister Mary Rose spied Catherine with dread and apprehension, the look of "what do I say" in her eyes. Catherine kept silent to where the injured nun lay and knelt next to Sister Mary Rose. Did Elizabeth? She started to ask. A sadness came over Sister Mary Rose as she shook her head and with a small voice answered, "No, no." How would she explain this? Her own complicated feelings toward the sister had surfaced. She realized that. Had she pulled so hard that she caused it? Or had Mary Paul in her reckless way contributed? Either way, there was no acceptable explanation for the actions of the two wives of Jesus. And had Elizabeth enjoyed the moment? Sister Mary Rose saw it, the smile. That scared the good nun the most. Yes.
Well, as I grew up Methodist and didn't know hardly anything about the Catholic Church, growing up Methodist, I didn't have much contact with Catholics, and so when I started reading this, the hardest thing for me to consume and get my head around was the whole idea of why would a little girl want a piece of paper that was a holy card? What is a holy card? Why would she want it? You know, it took me a while. I eventually got into it as I went through the book, but for a while I stumbled with that, and I kept asking myself that question as I read how everything was developing. So I guess what I just want to say is thank you for giving me that insight into that world, and for allowing all of us who didn't have the experience of Catholic school to see a little bit about what that was like, besides the nuns with the rulers that we've heard about so much.
Well, I think, Sister Janice, can you talk about holy cards? They're big. They were a big thing for little girls and boys.
Yeah, the holy cards are a picture, sometimes a painting, if it's too old, a long time ago, of a saint. And in the backside, it usually gives a prayer to that saint or for whatever the thing is that they were focused on. And so you got a holy card if you did something good, won the spelling bee or whatever.
Oh.
Or you got it also if you, it was like your patron saint,
Mhm.
example, or if there was a saint that was coming to be a saint, then everybody might get one.
So it was a reward.
Mhm.
Right. But it
Mhm.
also was something for prayer. And so it had that kind of significance as well.
Thank you,
Regardless, it was
sister.
special. It was special, right?
Oh,
Very
yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. And for Elizabeth to steal it because, well, she really thought she deserved it. Because, yeah, she did. She just thought she deserved it. And you find that in the story where the holy card is a really big deal to her and she wasn't going to get it. And she said, oh, what the heck, I'm going to steal it, which tells you a lot about Elizabeth. So Elizabeth is no saint.
Okay. A saint in the making.
A saint and may, well, she needs a little more making.
I would like to add another piece to it.
Sure.
My mother grew up in Catholic school also, but the Catholic school was a public school at that
Oh,
time. And so it was run by the same kind of rules, I guess, as public schools. My
yeah.
mother was left-handed. And at that
Oh.
time, you were not supposed to be left-handed because the world hadn't gotten to making left-handed irons and left-handed tools and stuff like that. And so it was practiced, not just in Catholic schools, but in public schools as well, to use that ruler. And so,
Oh.
yeah. And so if my mom was starting to write with her left hand, she got it across her knuckles because she was supposed to use her right hand. So it was I guess, the ethic of the day for all teachers, for all schools to have that same thing. Now, I think some of the Catholic school teachers stayed in as teachers longer in their lifetime than some of the public school teachers. So they were still using rulers when the public school quit it. So that's such a bad name.
Wow.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, it
I
did.
was a teacher for 26 years and never used a ruler and never slapped a kid.
Yeah. So, you were sort of the Sister Mary Rose because I did know really, really beautiful, wonderful, happy nuns. But then there were some that were very unhappy. And in the story, you learn about who those people are. And they became nuns, not because they wanted to be. So, and that played out a lot. But Sister Mary Rose was a beautiful, beautiful, just holy person is what she was for Elizabeth, for sure.
Was
Sounds
she
like
real?
Was she real?
In your
Yes,
life, was she real?
actually, there was a nun in my life. As my brother says, truth, partial truth, flat out lies. So the part that was true, there was a Sister Mary Rose in my life who was just full of joy, and she was happy to be there, and she loved children. She loved everything about her life. The other nun, Sister Mary Paul, was very real too, and her name was Sister Mary Pascal. And she didn't want to be a sister. She didn't want to teach children. She didn't like children. You could tell that. You could tell that right off the bat, where you could compare Sister Mary Rose and Sister Mary Paul in real life, and you could see it. There were some people that were just, they were called to this, and they were happy in their lives, and they were joyful. And yet there were some that should have stayed on the farm. But a lot of Catholic families, I don't know if Janice, you would concur this, but many Catholic families that had 11, 12 kids, one of them was going to be a priest or a nun.
Right.
That was just going to happen. And I talked to a lot of ex-nuns who said part of it was that was expected. It was expected in big families.
Well, by my time, that was not something that was expected, I guess. And I don't know, I never had that experience.
Yeah, right.
And when I decided that I wanted to do it, I wanted to go try it out. My parents didn't really want me to, but they didn't want to stand in my way. So I didn't know it till after I made final vows that they cried all the way home.
Oh, wow. Wow. That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah.
But by that time, they knew I was happy doing it. So they,
Yeah.
there's no
You were
problem.
happy. You were happy you'd found your calling. Yes,
Yeah.
sure. Any other questions or thoughts?
I think Vatican II also took
Tess.
a lot of people out.
Yeah. What?
So this is a holy card,
Yes.
Thanks, Terry. Thank you.
and this is Saint Teresa, and it was an award given to me on my patron saint day, right? I just went and got this out of my old, there was a whole bunch more, but they were awards. A little too close to home, Tess, but I loved the visualization of her escape.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was great, and I could almost see it in a movie, really.
Yeah. Yeah. But I want to read this to you because it really identifies every character of this family and the roles that they play and who they are and how this unit functions together. But they need money. And one of the ways to get money was to get scrap copper. So Patrick put together a plan, because that's what Patrick does. He plans. So he put this plan together that they could get enough copper to do what they needed to do. And they need to replace something that was broken. It's really important. And so this is their journey. Now, this really did happen. Okay. A small stockyard with wooden holding pens, half filled with snorting cattle, ran parallel to 5 sets of train tracks. The O'Sullivan siblings stood and stared at the pens. We need to get through here, then climb over the empty pens onto the railroad tracks, Patrick directed with just a hint of concern. I won't do it. This is stupid, Catherine says defiantly. Patrick let out a sigh. Not now, he thought. It will take too much time to go around. We need to climb into this bin right here, go over the side, then down the landing, go around the building, and down onto the tracks. Catherine folded her arms with determination. This was way too much, too dangerous. Was she the only one with any sense in this family? That is too dangerous. We could fall in and get trampled to death. James smiled, looked through the slats of the fence. This is just one dumb cow in this one. Patrick surveyed the area. Catherine, I won't do it, she resolutely replied. James knew what he had to do. I'll go first. He was the leader, so he climbed the wooden cow pen with ease, dropping into the pen with a large animal slept in the corner. He quickly crossed the pen, scaled the other side, and reached the landing. I'll go next, just a dumb cow. Before James could say a word, Elizabeth scaled the side of the wooden pen. She perched herself on the top of the stall and waved as if she were a homecoming queen in the annual parade. She leapt down, landed softly, and quickly righted herself squarely in front of the once sleeping animal. To her surprise, it wasn't a cow, but a large bull that pulled himself up and stood heads above Elizabeth. He snorted, with fragments of soft moisture coming out of his nose, lingering in the air and slowly drifting away. It was as if everything was in slow motion. Elizabeth did a double take. The eyes of the bull were mean and red and almost like they were squinting, trying to get a bead on Elizabeth. She moved very slowly, inching toward the other side of the pen. She tried to focus as the bull snorted again. I can do this, she said to herself. She began to shake like a volcano ready to erupt. She knew she must get control, move, and get out of the way of the gargantuan, a scary, fire in the eyes creature. What saint could fly? She tried to imagine. None. There were none. But angels flew, she thought. So she just had to be an angel. James knew he had to think of something to distract the bull, but all at once, Elizabeth jetted up the side and over the top with the speed of a Chuck Yeager fighter pilot. At least that is how James thought of it as he watched her make her way to safety. She breathed hard, trying to catch her breath, and kept the tears in check. She said nothing, but James saw the momentary slump in her very small shoulders. She was just a little girl, and he was the father brother. He should have not let her go. A moment of guilt, like a giant wave of water, swept over him. It was his job to protect her, but he had lapsed in judgment. He could never let that happen again, he vowed. A small knot swelled up in his throat. He trembled, turned to avoid the eyes of the others. He never wanted Elizabeth to be anyone other than who she was. He knew the day she stopped pretending to or living in another world would be the day that he should begin to worry. He looked at Catherine and Patrick, but still couldn't speak. Catherine wanted to get a better look at the animal in the pen, so she came as close as possible, peeked through the space between the wooden slats of the fence. Patrick joined her. The twins shuddered inside, but never uttered a word. The animal was a beast. They lost track of James and Elizabeth. They pondered what could have happened. As twins, they often had the same thoughts and really didn't need to say a word. Slowly, a small gate near the pen opened. Elizabeth and James had left the perch just above the bowl and found the opening that had been there all along. What are you two waiting for? Elizabeth said, recovered. Catherine gave James a stern look. Next time, we should probably just use the gate, she said, feeling very vindicated. James and Elizabeth joined the two accomplices at the fence, their eyes focused on the bull. The bull turned and snorted. He moved toward the fourth set of eyes peering through the fence. They had seen this fire before. A nervous, excited laugh rang out from Patrick before he commented, "Holy cow, that was close." "Need I remind you, that was not a cow," Catherine replied. They enjoyed the moment. Then James gave them the signal to head out, and they ran as fast as they could, giggling and laughing. It felt good. The sun overhead was bright and blinding. The siblings looked down the train tracks and saw movement in the distance, an approaching train. James stepped inside the tracks with Catherine close behind. There were 5 sets, each several feet apart. Rail cars sat, ready to be called up and put into action, partially blocking the view. Patrick stopped just over the last set of tracks and looked down at the ground. He saw something shiny. Hey, it's copper. Patrick was genuinely surprised. Elizabeth at the rear fell behind and stopped midway across the track. She looked down, also saw several long threads of bright, shiny metal. I see some too. Wow. Elizabeth was excited, didn't look back up. Her eyes were glued to the ground, picking up as many of the threads as she could. It was beautiful, and she wondered what she could make with it. She gently picked up each one and laid it across her palm. Maybe she could fashion a tieback for her hair, or better yet, a tieback for her mother. It would take lots of copper strands all tied together. They were similar in color, but still a little different from her mother's hair. A tieback would stand out, but not too much. She could see her mother proudly walking into church with her hair shimmering from the pieces of metal. Patrick was past the tracks when the train would soon travel. He looked back and saw Elizabeth and knew that she was somewhere else, lost in thought. A loud, hot whistle came out of nowhere. It hurt Elizabeth's ears, causing her to look down the track. What was coming at her? It was the size of a dragon, fire coming from its mouth. The blackness grew bigger, shifted, moved from side to side, leaping off the track into the sky and back down. She tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Mesmerized, her eyes stayed focused on it, and she didn't move. She couldn't. She was consumed with fear. The train was coming straight at her. Catherine looked back, saw Elizabeth stopped in the middle of tracks. Elizabeth, come on, stop fooling around. But Elizabeth didn't move. The fear was too big and she couldn't think it away. Fear had ripped through Catherine and she screamed again. Elizabeth, Elizabeth, come on, James cried with panic. In a very quick assessment, Patrick looked up and saw Catherine and James gripped with fear. But in the clear, the train, just nearly a block away, was bearing down. It couldn't stop. He took out like a bullet, racing towards Elizabeth. The train's warning blared. Patrick was just moments ahead of it as he dove for Elizabeth, snatching her up and bringing her close to his body as if they were one. He held on tightly. Catherine cried out in horror as James grabbed her and pulled her to his chest. The train sailed by with an earth-shattering noise. The brakes of the train suddenly screeched, trying to stop the behemoth with this load of new automobiles heading to the next big town. Brightly colored Chevrolets carried piggyback, stormed by with flashes of light stabbing through the pierced together train time after time. It was hypnotic. The weight carried the train down the tracks, blocks before it stopped. James searched through the landscape for 2 figures, his eyes filled with tears and blurred with the scene. Catherine slumped like a rag doll, all her senses gone from her body. It was the first time James ever held her so tight. He had to hold her upright. She couldn't stand by herself. He shook like a worn-out washing machine with a rag doll moving in his arms. The motion brought Catherine back to the present, but she wasn't ready to open her eyes. She didn't want to see. She felt out of control. The terror was heightened because she knew James was never afraid, not of their father when he should have been, not even of Mother Nature. He loved storms and he never hid from anything. He was big, so other boys never bothered him. But this time he was afraid. Catherine realized there was nothing she could do if Elizabeth and Patrick were gone. But first she would pray. If God let them live, she vowed never to complain about her sister again, ever, or at least she would try not to. She would also do a better job of protecting Elizabeth, and she'd be a better Catholic. If God let them live. She started to cry and couldn't finish her prayer. Catherine, Catherine, James said gently, not wanting to instill more panic. Catherine opened her eyes as the words and tears brought her back. She was ready to learn the fate of her siblings. There they were, two lumps. James could see them. Relief washed over him, although the stillness was not a good sign. But at least the train had not taken them. There was hope. He couldn't say more, his voice cracked. He waited a moment until the terror left, freeing his vocal cords. Come on, let's go get them. He was trying to be confident, but Catherine could hear the doubt. James and Catherine made their way across the tracks. The few unsteady steps they took that led them to the lumps seemed like a mile. They were laid still, silent, lodged to the metal tracks. Elizabeth, face down on her stomach with Patrick's arm under her, moved slightly. Slowly, James turned Elizabeth over. Her eyes opened, and she tried to focus. What was James doing? What just happened? Catherine moved towards Patrick and put her ear to his chest. His heart beat. Air blew out his nose. She scanned him from top of his head to his toes. He had a large scratch on his forehead and a bump was starting to emerge. He had taken most of the force from the fall that occurred when he tackled Elizabeth. He shielded her and protected her, slamming himself on the ground. Now a broken rib was crying out. Patrick, disoriented, opened his eyes to see Catherine. What a beautiful sight. He was alive, but where was Elizabeth? That was quickly answered. Where do you hurt? Catherine said. There was no anger. Elizabeth? Patrick's voice cracked, his pain crept into his consciousness. Here, she is here, with you, exactly where you put her. James said with just a hint of fun. Patrick closed his eyes, his voice stuck. A lump bigger than the one on his head had settled in his throat. He turned his head and saw the profile. She was safe. For a moment they rested, but only a moment. Patrick then realized the heaviness he felt in his arm was the weight of Elizabeth's head. He swallowed the lump in his throat. Well, I kind of hurt everywhere. That was an honest answer. James reached down and picked up Elizabeth, who rested her head on his shoulder. She was confused. One minute she was admiring the strings of copper on the ground, and the next she was stuck in cement and couldn't move. Then this. Her arm hurt where a big bruise surfaced, and the noise from the train filled her head. A numbness took over and she couldn't speak. Patrick was still a little shaken, legs wobbly, side hurting, head throbbing. Catherine grabbed his arm and tried to put it around her neck. A pain contortion overtook his face. He needed to lean on her. She would have to guide him. He couldn't lift his arm. We've got to get out of here before the crew gets us, James said. They scrambled over the tracks and disappeared down a tree-lined dirt road that led to a small bridge across a creek. The salvage yard was out of question. They were going in the wrong direction. Would have to wait. They had to get home. Off in the distance, two men ran towards the children. A row of trees served as a large canopy, shedding the area. Small scrub trees and bushes outlined the creek below, providing coverage for the fleeing siblings. James carried Elizabeth on his back while Patrick, stunned but mobile, moved with Catherine's help. The children traversed the upper level of the embankment, then down to a rock overhang into a small cave. The cave was dark, craggy, with trickling water, and the children were now enclosed. They felt safe. James stood next to the opening of the cave, looking where Catherine held Elizabeth close to her. Elizabeth quiet, not sure what happened. Things she just couldn't take in at the moment. Patrick sat unsteadily on the rock-covered floor, braced up against the cave wall. His head hurt a lot. He felt sick to his stomach and didn't say a word. He couldn't say anything because his thoughts seemed to be frozen. He tried to form words, but they wouldn't come. He was just as overwhelmed as the rest of his siblings, maybe more. He saw the train face to face. Another near miss. It was too much. He might cry, might begin to doubt himself as he stopped thinking. They're gone by now, James said, almost as a wish. He looked over at Patrick and could see the knot in his head was growing. They needed to get him home, sneak him into the house, get some ice. They hoped for the best. How's your head? James asked, hoping that Patrick wouldn't say something awful like he hit his head so hard he couldn't see. It's just a scratch. Patrick knew the truth wouldn't matter. If his head hurt, if his head kept hurting like this, he wouldn't have to go to a hospital. He knew that about stuff like concussions. He looked up at the school after an event at home when he took a broom to his father's head. He wouldn't wait it out. He'd have to have a plan, but just not now. His head hurt too much. James saw the pain in Patrick's eyes. He diverted his gaze to Elizabeth. Elizabeth? Huddled together, Catherine watched her sister closely, trying to find some reaction, but the face remained still, no motion, just quiet. Inside, Elizabeth relived the moment over and over. The fear she felt when the train was bearing down was the greatest that she'd ever experienced. She had become immobile, her feet hard and heavy. She believed if she thought about the noise, the smell, the whistle enough times, she would be immune to the fear she now felt. She repeated the image over and over again, and the more she thought, the more she realized that the fear of the train, which immobilized her, was a different kind of fear. It was unlike the fear of her father's rage or the nun's switch that stung and embarrassed her. The train, the thing that could have sent her sailing 5,000 miles, was something new and different, truly non-human. There could never be negotiations with the train. Her father, although just as dangerous because he could take her life, was not made of metal. He could be tricked. He could bleed. He could die. He was human. It was not a good thing that it just happened. Catherine knew it was another red flag. Everything was churning out of control, and she held Elizabeth even closer. There was no need to taunt. I told you so. Catherine could see the feeling of failure in James' mannerisms, especially his eyes when he looked past her. Let's go home. Mom will be waiting, she said. I'll go first and make sure the coast is clear. James needed to make up for his part in this fiasco, so he came out of the cave first and purposely slowly climbed the embankment before pausing. He waited until it was perfectly still. Patrick opened his fist, revealing a small piece of copper. He started to shake his head in disbelief, then stopped. It hurts to do that. Stupid was his first thought. He paused, took a deep breath, waited for the pain to recede, no more shaking of the head. Even the haze of pain, he knew he couldn't give up the plan. It was still a good way to make money. Okay, that was positive. Just had to find a better way to get into the salvage yard. He would work out the plan. That's if he didn't have a blood clot and die in his sleep. The conversation with himself was headed to a dead end. He laughed at that thought, dead end. Patrick was not one to roll around in self-pity. Guess we'll have to come back tomorrow. Patrick was talking to himself. No one was listening. James looked around. The coast was clear. He waited for the rest to follow. Catherine pulled Elizabeth up and took her by the hand. She was moving, but mostly lifeless. The lights were dimmed. Patrick inched up the side of the cave, mimicking the downward spiral that took him to the spot. Out of the corner, James' eyes saw two men approaching the embankment. He could see them, but they couldn't see him. He didn't know the men, but he had seen them in church. They seemed like all the other men in town, nondescript, average, nothing stood out. But one was just a little bigger, more masculine than the other. They could have been twins, but they weren't. He motioned to his siblings to hit the dirt, lie still, be silent, all done with one hand gesture. They knew what he meant. Those damn kids are lucky, said one of the men who was just a little bit larger than the other. What in the hell were they doing playing on the tracks? They stopped just feet from James and looked around. Their sight line was too high. Dumb kids. One of them looked familiar. James hoped they were nondescript to the men as the men were to him. I think one was O'Sullivan's kid, which drew a grimace from James. Oh, Sullivan. I sure wouldn't want to be that kid when the old man finds out. You hear about his wife? Some kind of accident? An accident? I'm sure that's his side of the story. The man's wife had her suspicions and told him so. Too many bruises and feared that the O'Sullivan's woman's eyes when she thought she might be late. She had the voice of an angel. My wife sang with her in the church choir. She barely talked now. No, the guy choked her. The harshness of the moment descended upon the children. Each knew the truth of their lives, but they didn't know others knew it too. Catherine wasn't sure how much Elizabeth was taking, and she hoped her sleepwalking state would keep her inoculated. The men turned away from the embankment. The smaller man stopped. You know what? I didn't recognize anyone today. The men hurried down the dirt road and out of sight. The children sat, their emotions trickling out dry tears. They all wanted to cry, but none of them would. What would a few tears do anyway? It was clear. They all felt the same. They were none. The road home would be slow. Patrick's knot was too big to ignore, and they knew he would struggle to explain it if his parents had asked what happened. He would have to avoid both his mother and father. Elizabeth wasn't talking, almost a first for her, but she was thinking. When James finally gave them the coast, his clear sign, the gesture to rise reminded Elizabeth of the parish priest during Mass. Sit for the scriptures, send for the gospel at the Alleluia verse. Some things never fade. They hang in the air, dangling within reach. Okay.
Yes, I think my heart wants to say that turned your whole relationship with Catherine around.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She was just so if she just lives, I will do everything right. I'll be a better Catholic. I'll be a better sister. The praying it was totally there. Just let her be alive. Just let her be alive. And also Patrick, because Patrick, he took his life in his hands, and he truly did. And in real life, he did absolutely to save. Yeah.
My thought is, I want to know which one of your brothers it was. I know only one of them is still with us, but if it's the right one, I'd like to send him a thank you for saving my friend Tess, because you have enriched my life so much, not only with this book, but with your friendship.
Yeah. Well, if Patrick is Tom in Denver. Yeah. Michael is James, who passed some years ago. And of course, Catherine is my sister, who passed 3 years ago. And the baby is John. And I have to tell you, I asked him, have you read it yet? And he goes, well, the baby doesn't say that much. Thank you so much.
All right.
It was good.
Yes,
Take
bye.
care. Love
Thank you
y'all.
And I-
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.